Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening and welcome to this special show sponsored by Catt, where we're going to dive into the power of explicit teaching with our guest, Zach Groshell. He's got this brilliant book here, Just Tell Them, The Power and Explanations and Explicit Teaching. And we're going to go into this transformational book. Now, Zach's a teacher, instructional coach and consultant, and his book, Just Tell Them, challenges those misconceptions found in explicit teaching and provides those practical strategies for delivering high quality instruction that supports all our learners. So good evening, good morning to you, Zach. How are you today?
Oh, I am great. I'm so happy to be able to catch up with you, James. It's been almost 2 years since we've last talked. So I'm excited to hear what you have for me today.
Brilliant. Yeah, it only seems like yesterday we had this conversation on a long-time friend on Teachers Talk Radio. And I know that this will go really in-depth, but go through something that I think has actually come out at a really good time in education. It challenges a lot of the norms and conventions, but also it goes back to things that are really rooted in cognitive science, and it just challenges some of those thoughts and feelings we've had. But what I think is really important for our audience, you've had a really interesting journey and something slightly different. And last time we talked about the differences between American education and UK. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your purpose and why education is at the forefront of what you do as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I got into or sort of stumbled into education like a lot of people do, right? What do I want to do with my life? And my mom's a teacher. And do I really want to do what my mom did, kind of thing, and finally got into teaching and I lived my whole life just not really not admiring to, perhaps underrating what my mom did as a 42-year-old veteran. She retired this year. But then, you get into that classroom after taking lots of courses around sort of maybe the sociological aspects of teaching or the political parts of teaching, the history of education. And you get into the classroom after 2 years of spending $25,000 on this, like how our programs work. And you get into that classroom and you're just so ill prepared. And oftentimes the first job you can get is the job where most teachers are fleeing from, right? So you get the job at the hardest school in the hardest part of town, which is what I did. And then you just have to figure it out. And some people do that a lot better than others. They come in on the weekends, they put everything they have into it, and others they burn out, or they get lucky enough to have an instructional coach who supports them. And so I've had all those experiences, and I'm just obsessed. I'm obsessed with teaching. I think what you're getting at, though, is this sort of inquiry-based, problem-based type of thing. That was definitely what was popular and trendy when I started my teaching program, and what I would consider in the United States to be the most commonly suggested sort of methodology or type of teaching, where mostly if you explain the material, if you get all the kids sitting and looking at you, if you control the game, you're robbing them of something, either their deeper understanding, their creativity, their ability to be agentic, sort of self-directed learners, independent learners. It's even though I think a lot of teachers are teaching from the front and using some form of explicit instruction, we don't get the training that we should in how to explain things, how to break stuff down, how to teach responsively. So that's why I wrote this book, and I'm so happy to talk to you about it today.
Yeah, and thank you for Catt for putting us in touch and doing this, because the show's brought to you in partnership with Catt, publishers of professional development books and resources that support that great teaching and learning in schools. You can go and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles and use the code JCTTR 24.25 for 20% off your order, and you can get your own copy of Just Tell Them. Now, this idea of figuring it out is a really important one, and it's kind of shifted your your element onto explicit instruction. And I feel like through the training and through everything else, you worked out, and you wrote in your book, you realised the effective teacher, not just about keeping information from children, but providing the information the children need to think about and getting them to think hard about it. And so what was the catalyst that moved you from this idea of the discovery and inquiry-based learning into something that actually, well, no, let's go back to the roots. They need this new information. We need to take them on this journey. So what started your challenge of your own practice that made you think, actually, what I'm doing, that's not right. I need to look at this in a different way.
Well, remember that I taught primary, like ages like 8 through 10, mostly at the beginning. So I had to teach all the subjects, and teaching all the subjects, I got a lot of opportunities to try things out, to try often on my own without any sort of feedback from anyone else. And I would, sometimes try something for math and then try something for science and see kind of how it would go. And I just remember how many times the time was kind of running out, the unit's about over, the semester break is coming up and so on. And maybe there's this test, or the parents are going to come in and they're supposed to observe this big project or something. And I'd bring everyone up as close as I could in a huddle right at the board and go, guys, this is what we need to do because it's not working out, right? You sort of feel a little bit embarrassed thinking back that, why didn't I do that up front? Why didn't I prepare them? Why didn't I scaffold and basically control the instructional design? Let me just give an example. I had this, most people know about that big science fair that is popular in many American schools, where all the parents come and they circulate around and everyone has a trifold board and there's a little experiment up front. On the board is the science that underpins the experiment, right? And I just remember year one going, everyone invent your own experiment and I'll come around and I'll give feedback and we'll develop it. And it was a disaster. I mean, I didn't understand why some kids did better than others is because their parents were helping. I didn't understand why some kids couldn't do anything. They just couldn't put any words to the paper. At year two, it was somewhere in the middle where I directly taught the science, but then had them perhaps dive into the experiment too early. And year three was, we're going to spend about 48 hours on those boards and about 6 weeks on the science. And the difference was just astounding that you could not even try to exaggerate, that the parents could circulate, meet with students, and they would talk to their child and hear this sophisticated monologue about the science that the child had prepared. And they would go, these kids are getting a great education, right? These kids are getting this isn't just for playtime. And I think that's really one of those many, many different moments where I went, we can get them there, but it's just, there's much more efficient and effective ways of doing it than a lot of this inquiry discovery stuff.
Yeah, and it's this episodic memory of, I know we often joke and talk about making Stonehenge out of ball burns or having the moon and the shapes and phases through that way. And it's going back to, over the last few years in the UK, we've really thought about the curriculum development. What's the journey we want our pupils to go on? And we're carving that out. But actually, we need to be explicit with that foundation knowledge. And there are countries around the world who've come back and said, actually, what is a knowledge rich? The skills are there because you've got to have the skills to apply it and have the depth and the mastery behind it. But that starting with, what is that core bit of knowledge we want our pupils to know? What is it? What is it also? And then we can address those. It's absolutely key within there. But I think there's an almost, if we even step back even more, you talk about in your book about the cognitive architect of limited memory, limited working memory, and then the unlimited long-term memory. And we've all seen that, the map and the imagery of that. But how does that link into this idea of explicit instruction and also that being really specific about what you want children to learn?
Yeah, and I think that the information processing model that kind of underpins that is now, fortunately, in the hands of more educators, sort of baked in, I think, to your early teacher training. In the United States, this is brand new stuff for a lot of teachers. Maybe they took a psychology 101 course in their bachelor's degree, and they can kind of remember those couple of chapters around cognitive science, but it's not something that many teachers learn. And we have a lot of we're sort of fed a lot of brain-based stuff. So teachers are like, yeah, like I'm working with how the brain works, the teenage brain. There's nothing really behind that of substance. It's just sort of in the air, right? So when I'm talking to schools and I bring up that we have this limited working memory that unfortunately we can't really do much about, we're all sort of endowed with what this is, but the cheat code is to override that limited working memory is essentially to have lots of facts and experiences in long-term memory. And you give them examples of, you have the multiplication algorithm, many steps, but also in there are smaller problems that are multiplication facts. You know the multiplication facts. You can solve this in seconds. You can read passages that if you have the right phonics, little squiggles on the page memorized, and you know how to blend those sounds, you know what the words mean. You can read. Everything that you do is sort of is influence. We need to go back to that model of the mind. Explicit instruction, I think, at least how I describe explicit instruction, it derives its moves on that information processing model, so that you wouldn't start by giving students this big whole complex task and saying, grapple with it, struggle with it, work with your partner with it. Because this novice next to you doesn't know how to teach it, right? It starts with breaking it down or increasing the support to such a way that everyone can answer correctly. Everyone can respond with a quick response. And then that slow removal of the scaffolds, or the slow, gradual increasing of challenge. So you end up at the end getting a lot of what everybody wants, this sort of end goal of kids working on problems, solving things, but they have knowledge to draw from that prohibits that working memory from getting overloaded, from them getting frustrated, from them sort of quitting and expressing a lot of negative behaviors we don't want them to.
And that frustration and that negative behavior is a really cool component of this. But I know you've written a whole book on it, but let's define, what is explicit instruction? What do you define it as a really concise and clear definition? Because that's actually not easy in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, at its heart, it's a scaffolded process, right? And we know the metaphor of scaffolding, where you start with all the scaffolds up at first to hold up this structure, right? And that's best facilitated by a teacher, right? You regulate the flow of information. You control the instructional design, so that only the information that the student needs to attend to is in the environment, is given to the students. All that other stuff is excluded, right? You highlight the essential information, cut the irrelevant, or at least the information that doesn't need to be taught right now. And so through taking away those supports, eventually the student is independently doing that thing with just minimal guidance, like some prompts, some hints, some questions. And in that scaffolded process, so I said the first part of the definition is explicit instruction is practically synonymous with scaffolding. We also have a highly interactive delivery system where the student is engaged through repetitive questions back and forth between the teacher and the student. That serves like a ton of purposes. One is it tells the teacher whether they can speed up or slow down, or that they're not getting it. It also leverages retrieval practice, and it leverages a lot of sort of student voice, so we can bounce ideas around and really get to misconceptions and misunderstandings. It also just increases attention, right? If you're constantly engaging the students through questions, they know they can't just opt out. They know they're going to be called on. They're going to be asked to initiate their own response on a mini whiteboard. So a scaffolded process that is highly interactive, that starts with the teacher, ends with the student doing it independently, that's my stab at it for today.
And I think that is a really important one. We've got a really an interesting question here. How do you then motivate that independent learning to those who are not willing to engage? And I know we may unpack this a bit later as well, but how would you respond to that as a question?
Yeah, well, a lot of independent learning happens to be, not all of it, happens to be students given things that they can't do. So is it a won't do problem, like a motivation problem, like you're mentioning, or is it a can't do? And that you cannot know that answer to that question if you just throw them in the deep end, right? Are they trying to sabotage my lesson? Are they fighting against me? Are they lazy? Or is this a deficit in skills? Do they not have the prerequisites? Or have I not given them the proper information they need to be able to bring to bear to do the independent work? You do explicit instructions so that it's just crystal clear what you need to do, how to do it. You've seen examples of how to do it. You've responded throughout, so the teacher's not let you falling off the bus. Then you go into your independent work. My view is at this point, you've gathered up 90% of the kids on that basis alone. I can do this. I love to feel successful. Everyone else is successful. So am I. I'm part of something. I'm part of a group, right? You're going to get kids, because I've worked in tough schools. You're going to get kids that they fought you that whole time. They get there and they're going to fight you there, right? Now we're talking about other things. We're talking about how to use your progressive discipline policy at your school. We're talking about how to bring in parents. How do you get the child to do something that is perhaps at first seems trivial, but then that gives them that first taste of success, and you can build off of that in the future, right? Dealing with those kids who really fight you tooth and nail is, I think, only something you can really manage if you get all these other pieces in place before you get to the independent learning.
And it is the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? If you don't know that prior learning, you don't know where those pupils are, you can't bring them then on the journey. And also you have the danger of so many misconceptions that you can go off in different tangents. Actually, that's not relevant to our learning now, or that's relevant, but we need to do these one or two steps before we get to it. And I think that's a really key element of this journey. But when you talk about this interactivity, I know when I was training many years ago now, we were told to minimize teacher talk. And it's one of those feedbacks we often get. It sounds great in theory, making sure the students struggle as they need to, they have the guidance, but actually it's a shift in that interactivity, that back and forwards, almost a ping pong style. And it's probably a lot is unlearning those common education beliefs, not rooted in foundation of cognitive science and what we've learned from research, but how has it made you then let go of some of those teaching habits or those beliefs that you've heard from others and embrace a more structured and deliberate way of delivering explanations and teaching?
Yeah, like that teacher talk line, is it's a great way to kind of gaslight teachers, dismiss them. It's kind of an evaluation line, right? Limit teacher talk. The evaluator leaves. Ooh, I gave them some advice, right? It's terrible advice, but there's always a grain of truth in everything, right? I talk a lot about economy of language, and when you strip your language of the unnecessary stuff, you're going to end up with sort of minimal statements. And if you're constantly doing interactive teaching, you're not going to talk for very long, right? You're going to say something, give an example, bam, now we're back at the student, and now you're collecting responses and you're listening. But the teacher, if you counted the minutes and you look at Rosenshine's kind of estimates of counts of minutes, there's going to be a lot of teacher talk, right? The teacher is leading the learning, so they're asking the questions. They're getting kids to build on each other's answers, and they're explaining stuff. I I particularly like some of the best teaching I've ever seen starts with stories, and the teacher immerses the student in this story. And it's time to watch the show, kids. And they want to watch, right? They're sitting there in silence, leaning forward. As an instructional coach, you look into a window, of the door, of the classroom, and you want to get in there right away because you see a whole class is captivated by what this teacher is saying. And this teacher goes through a kind of beginning, a middle, and an end, and highlights conflict and causality, and tells this whole story. And there's just this love of subject that permeates the classroom. And guess what? The kids didn't talk for like 15 minutes, right? But who cares, right? This is what bad advice that is. What was your question anyway, now that I've gone off on a...
No, it's the idea of this pressure of needing to talk less. And I think it's often a big misconception, isn't it? And the fact that those analogies and stories, and I know you wrote about that in your book, about the importance of them, and we'll talk about what makes a great teacher explanation in a minute. But I think it's a massive preconceived misconception that direct instruction it's a monologue. And you wrote, actually, I'll just find the quote because I wrote it down, say, effective explanation is not a monologue, it's dialogic. So you're interactive, and the teacher and student take turns. And as you say, it is a short interactive, right, I'm going to say something, you're going to repeat it back with a call response, or I'm going to model something and you're going to go and do it. And it's so quick, it's so tight, and it's so deliberate in the language and really thinking about that. It is a shift. It is different. It is more so less of the I do, we do, you do. Actually, it's a lot of we do. We're back and forward doing that aspect. And I think that is a framework that is completely different to what we would see in the traditional classroom that we're used to as well.
And I think a lot of the pushback against this, like to your point, is that they didn't start with the definition I provided, right? We're talking about old school teaching or something. And I like this kind of traditional versus progressive framing that starts with Dewey or whatever. And I would consider myself like just one of those trads, right? But there's sort of a bad trad out there that Tom Sherrington calls this in one of my favorite posts of his, where it's just, yay, Zach's talking about explicit instruction, direct instruction. And I do that, but the reality is the teacher's just kind of droning on. The kids are kind of sitting there passively. Teacher has no idea, or maybe even doesn't demonstrate any interest in who's learning it, who's not getting it. What are the students getting out of this? And then bam, here's an assignment, right? Here's a test. Geez, these kids aren't as good as the past kids I've had. I only got 40%. Last year, they were all acing this test. And you go, that's not what I'm wanting to argue for. There is a long tradition, pardon me again, of folks like Anita Archer and Doug Lemov. And we saw that Pritesh Raichura video come out from the that documentary, Great Teaching Unpacked, where this methodology is being used everywhere that I'm talking about, that is highly interactive. It's very warm, strict, demanding, get everyone to respond. And it's tough. It's tough to learn this. This is why I'm so passionate about it, because I think it's necessary. And I think it's the bee's knees. I think it's the best thing in the world, right? It's like rocket fuel for learning. It gets kids there quick. They feel successful. You get everything out of it, but the teacher ultimately is responsible for the learning and is leading it.
And I think that's really important. So what are the essence of what makes a great teacher explanation? You've alluded to a few bits, but what is the essence of what makes a great teacher explanation?
Well, let's begin by just presenting the information you need to say, and a kind of an economy of language principle. I go into some of the research around this that I wasn't familiar with before I started writing the book, around a lot of what we know is sort of comparing clear and unclear formats of an explanation. You kind of can't talk about clarity without giving examples. And so unclear explanations include a lot of sort of hesitations, false starts, ums and ahs. The teacher might want to tell students about things they're going to learn about, but it's not time to talk about that yet because it It diverts their attention. It doesn't focus them. And a lot of times teachers maybe, I hesitate to say this because I don't want anyone to feel like their personalities are insulted, but there's just a lot of sort of extraneous kind of humor and tangents going down paths that don't need to be told. It's got to be quick, and it's got to be direct, and it's got to be explicit with some empathy for the fact the kids in front of you don't know this yet. They can't handle all these other places your mind wants to go. So you as the expert have to sort of be disciplined in just providing that information step by step in small step presentations. I guess for another area we could go into is I really believe in the power of using different tools such as visuals. The teacher just talking and explaining without reference to something concrete, I think is a no-no. I go into the multimedia principles of Richard Mayer and how essentially dual coding theory, where students will benefit from a reference point. The teacher's pointing to different aspects of what they're learning. The teacher's giving examples. I talk about sort of principles of direct instruction with example presentation. And in a way, the student needs to inquire into what's on the board, focus their attention on that as the teacher leads them through the information and gives really crisp, clear statements to describe it. I'm sure you're going to ask me more questions, but like it's just two fun areas for people to talk about.
And we talked all the way through so far about leading the pupils through these small steps. So what's the catalyst then for planning? So let's step back a bit. What are the couple of things that a teacher needs to do in planning a lesson or a sequence about when they're trying to use this approach to make sure that they aren't going off unnecessary tangents and making sure that they are really explicit in their explanation? Is it to focus on the language? Is it to focus on the small steps? What would you say is important? Because I think as a school and as a trust that we're going through a very much similar process at the moment. And going back to this idea of there was a teacher who reflected after seeing a lesson and implementing some of these direct instruction tactics. He was like, I've been here for 14 years. I've always told these stories and it's part of my personality. And then I had someone from Ukraine who came in and they did not follow me for 15 minutes of my lesson. They did not know because I was going off on the story. And I was like, well, that was really brave for them to say that, first of all. But second of all, she won't be the only one. And that's the thing. And it just a light bulb moment. And so actually, I need to be more precise. And then stories come in. But he just realized actually what I thought was effective is not. And it was just amazing to see that.
I had that moment when I taught overseas. I taught in Vietnam, and day one, the first thing was that all the kids took off their shoes, and I was like, I didn't have a shoe rack or anything for them to put their shoes on. I realized I'm already screwed, right? I have no idea what I'm doing here. And then the day one, I went in to do a story. I just said, so this happened to me over the summer, and it had to do with going to a bathhouse and using there was a sponge that was very rough. And I told this whole story, and nobody was laughing at what I thought was a hilarious story. And I realized they got hung up on the word sponge. They got hung up on a ton of words in this story that would have landed for an English speaking audience. And they were all, they wanted to laugh. They wanted to be part of it. I guess this is kind of goes back to our discussion around long-term memory, right? What you know determines what you see. And you don't need to explain jokes to people that understand the reference that you're making, but you do need to when someone doesn't have that background knowledge, doesn't know the necessary information to be able to give that laugh or be able to inquire and discover. With planning, another John Catt book I recommend is Gene Tavernetti's Teach Fast, because he goes into a lot of planning. And FAST is just the framework for explicit instruction. I think it stands for like focused, adaptive, structured, T is eluding me. But in that book, one of those light bulb moments I had was really how those lesson objectives or learning intentions are really for the teacher to keep them on track, right? You get those sometimes abstract statements that here at schools and teachers often require their teachers to write on the board and have posted in a certain way. But that's really your guideline for in that lesson. I'm going to assess this in some way. The practice at the end of the lesson needs to match what I started to teach them at the beginning of the lesson. And anything that doesn't contribute to that goal is extraneous, is unnecessary, or it's wasted time. So I think being very careful around as you plan your lesson that everything you say, every question you do, all the practice that you assign, it's all in alignment to the goal of, do they know this by the end? I also think a lot of teachers overestimate what a kid can learn in a single lesson, or how much information should be presented. We're always trying to cover information. We've got a national curriculum or a state curriculum or a district curriculum that is loaded with all types of stuff. 20% of it may not even be needed, and we got to get through it. So there's this feeling that it would be better to cover it than to teach it properly. And I kind of lean on the side of teach it properly and let the other stuff maybe just be more peripheral. Maybe it comes in here and there, but teach what you got with enough structure and support so all the kids actually remember it, actually learn it,
Yeah, and that book, as you said, the Teach Fast in Zach's book, Just Tell Them, it's available on the John Catt website. So please go to johncattbookshops.com to explore the full range of titles and use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. And thank you for John Catt for sponsoring tonight's show. Now, we're talking about this interactivity, we're talking about this idea of that key language that goes throughout the lesson and what you need to do. But how then can you check for understanding without disrupting that flow? Because you're talking about it not being a monologue, we're talking about the interactivity. And we've already alluded to that, actually, the pupil's attention is there. That prerequisite for good quality learning. But how do you really check, that children are on that journey with you? They haven't gone off on tangents as well.
Yeah, I think you need to take kind of a cluster approach, which is the walkthrough guys. I'm just going to keep saying John Catt books because I love the guys at John Catt. I'll just be honest. The walkthrough guys talk about kind of a cluster approach where teachers understand the relationships between many different multiple techniques that work in tandem, in concert, as opposed to just a single method of checking for understanding. If I had to kind of cluster my favorites, I'm really checking for listening through choral response. I'm getting everyone to respond kind of an I say, you say, or on signal, get ready, hand drop. Everybody says the answer at the same time. If their eyes are facing down, I'll do a snap or a click on the board or something so that kids can maintain their focus on what they're reading while hearing the signal. But then what that's doing is it's getting me to make sure that they are revoicing the information, that they are following along with me, that they're not just tuning out. And then I'm going to do a lot of cold calling. Essentially, and cold calling can interact so well with turn and talks. So turn and talks, cold calling, and choral response kind of in tandem, where I teach a little bit, I say just a little bit, and then turn to your partners, how does that work? Or give it a go, right? And the kids turn, and I stand in place and I do a be seen looking, right? If I get my class quiet quickly enough, and this is not one of those punchy just 15-second turn and talks, I might circulate, listen in, put an ear down. Maybe I'll do a couple of nonverbals, making sure everyone's turning and talking. Then we bring it back to me in 3, 2, 1, hands in the air. Now I'm cold calling again, right? the flow of a lesson like this is elegant, but it is fast paced. It's quick, and everybody needs to respond. It's not a lot of like, listen to me for the next 15, 20 minutes. Then I will check to see if anyone was paying attention, check to see if anyone is understanding it. It's already too late. You've given them 15 pieces of information. And now which of those do they know and don't know? I've got to do that as I introduce each part of this through a small step presentation.
And it is that decision tree as a teacher, isn't it? It's that fact that, okay, I'm going to just tell you this tiny little bit. Do you understand it? What is it? What is it also? Can you tell me whether it's cold calling, talk to your partner, come back to me? And then actually, okay, we are ready. We're on the line. But what's the impact on this approach for our most vulnerable pupils? Those that we would maybe have SEN or our first 20% in the classroom. What have you seen from your coaching and your experience in classrooms, their impact is? Because the preconceived idea, and I keep going back to this idea of preconceived, because when you go and talk, say, about direct instruction, they think Victorian, very traditional approach of doing it, is that they won't keep up. It's not for them. They can't manage it. So what experience have you had with that? And then any stories or analogies from there?
Yeah, well, if you're just teaching and then given an assignment or something, they're certainly not going to keep up, right? What's going to happen is 2 or 3 kids in your class who are nodding their heads really nicely and giving lots of hand raising. They're going to lead your classroom, and you're going to feel like you're going to get this sense that you're teaching well. And you're going to miss out on all the misconceptions that certain kids in your class have. Kids who struggle mask their confusion very, very good, very, very well. They've gone through school so far feeling like failures in multiple environments. And when they get to your class, they have the act all together, right? They can nod their head, or when you come around, they look at you and give you a thumbs up, right? But they don't understand it. And the only way you can check is if they tell you what it is. If they solve a problem in front of you, you can only learn how much they know by directly observing their performance in that moment and making a judgment. Is it time to move on, or is it time to bring it back? You have kids with special education needs, and you do your circulation, you do your cold calls, you do your turn and talks, and you find out couple of kids, same kids, aren't getting it. You go back to the front and you say to everyone, we have a couple of misconceptions in the classroom. Let me go ahead and address those right now, right? We don't move on. And we also, in assessing everybody's understanding, we can do some of the more sophisticated differentiation moves that would otherwise be impossible. Like, you find out that everyone's got it. There's really 2 kids in the class who are missing many years of past information. This is the time to get everyone working and bring kids up to your desk or to that small table in the back and do some quick direct teaching with them. Hey, I know you've missed a few days lately. This is what you're missing, right? You can't do that without getting everyone's responses. The problem with a lot of this inquiry-based learning is we give them something that's frankly so silly and easy and unsophisticated so that not everyone is throwing a fit. So the first thing is that what they're doing is lame, but then you're going around and you can't figure out why the kids don't understand it because you don't have them all looking at you. You didn't explain it up front. So now you're teaching one kid at a time, and it just eats itself. And what happens is the kids with special education needs, they drown in those situations. There's a reason why explicit instruction, a lot of its proponents come out of the special education world, right? They come out of it knowing kids with weaker processing, weaker working memory, kids with attention, issues with attention, that they thrive on these structures, and they can only thrive in a classroom that adjusts based on their struggles along with everybody else's, that weighs their needs with everybody else's and uses formative assessment, which you can't do as well when everyone's working off on their own thing, doing their own thing.
And I think that's the key bit, isn't it? We don't get the structures right, and we don't get this cognitive science of small steps and checking for understanding of it. Actually, we're doing all children a disservice, and it is a element of you've got to keep up then, and it shouldn't be. We should bring everyone along for the journey, and the depth will come through our explanations, through our justification, through our discussion, and through our formative assessment. Actually, we should be teaching, not necessarily to the top, we should be actually teaching for special education needs, and we can then develop depth behind it. And you talked about this idea of visuals earlier. And I think I have a bit of a thing at the moment where we're using tools like PowerPoint, where we're just clicking through slides and just getting through the content. So I want you to talk a little bit about your opinion on visuals, and I know you talked about it within your book as well, and the dual coding. Where are they best placed, and how can we get away from this element of let's just click through a PowerPoint, this is the content we need to deliver, and we're going to get to the end of the PowerPoint regardless of where the children are?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we go back to that information processing model, right? Where we say like focused processing, like attention on what you're learning and thinking about that is going to lead to long-term potentiation. That's going to lead to learning, right? And so if you think about a PowerPoint slides, which I use all the time, I'm not one of those people either that a school has to go a certain direction. I've worked with schools that they had centrally planned PowerPoints. I've worked with schools that had centrally planned booklets. I've worked with schools that had visualizers that used individual worksheets and so on. Like all of these are tools that could be used if you keep this information processing model in mind. What are the kids thinking about? With a PowerPoint slide that it has a ton of information on it, and the teacher needs to read it and then click through it, we're getting lots of interference with learning. So lots of text on the board. Some kids are reading it, some kids are not. You got a teacher who is just going through it. Now we're not checking for understanding. Now we're not seeing if they get it. The teacher doesn't pause and say, everyone read the slide, right? Just for a moment, I'm gonna give everyone 30 seconds to read it. Now turn and talk to your partner. What are you getting out of this? What are some of your takeaways, right? Teacher walks around and circulates. The explicit instruction is a system. So whatever tools you use, we need to get the kids to think hard about the information that's presented to them. What you described was perhaps a one or two teachers in a school that's probably doing things right who are using this tool improperly. And what they need is probably training and coaching, and maybe a kick in the butt to not do that anymore, right? That is not good teaching. And giving them a visualizer and having them do it on that way is not going to change that problem either. They're just going to change the tool and not the method. So,
and I think that is the problem. You think a new tool will solve it, and it never does, isn't it? A tool will only support the foundation, your philosophy, and the pedagogical understanding that you have as a teacher. So we need to get to the root of it, make sure that's explicit, and then that's where we use the best tool for the best situation to put that in. But I want to dive a little bit more into, because you've written a chapter about this idea of models and show what it is and what it isn't. And often when I was helping out a teacher and coaching them the other week, we were saying, let's start with a discover task where it's a misconception completely. And I just turned it back on them and said, well, do the children know what it is? Are we teaching them a falsehood, or are we going to actually raise a misconception that's not necessarily needed at the moment? We just need to explore what it is, what it also is, and do that. And you talked about it in terms of shape and symmetry, but what's the importance of the visuals there and the variation theory behind that underpins it, and your experience of that?
Yeah, well, I think most teachers would agree and have heard the concept of examples and non-examples. Like they understand that. But one of the hardest things about giving a good example is picking the right ones. And that takes planning. And luckily we have Chat GPT and AI, which I know some folks are still not sold on, but that is a pathway at this point of give me some examples of this teach this to me like I was a kid with examples. And you can see some of those that come out that you otherwise might not have thought of. It takes really deeply like dredging your own long-term memory to go like, what would be a proper, instance of this thing, right? Whether it's an abstract word like appease, or it's a science term like living things, right? What is a living thing? And now you have to go to your subject knowledge. Oh, it's a thing that reproduces, or do they know that, right? And so on and so forth, right? And so, what is important about examples and non-examples is that it's not just something that it is an opposite and then move on. The kids can go. It's really about varying what it is to provide contrast between things that are actually the same thing. This is also an example of it. But what do you notice? Highlight the structures that are the surface features that make it a little bit different. You can give it, a simple example I always give is like between an elephant and a rhinoceros. You can go, a rhinoceros is not an elephant, but notice the things that make them the same. I could see how you would think it is, but it's different because of X, Y, and Z features, right? And highlighting similarities and differences between a variety of examples, basically through a very careful sequence, can illuminate for the child and basically help them to construct the boundaries of what that thing is. What we do, however, because we're teaching on the fly and we're unplanned a lot of times, is we go, hey, everybody, what does the word appease mean? And kid in the front goes, appease, is that like please? And you go, no, that's not it. Anyone else? Appease, what is appease? Okay. Well, appease means, and you write the definition on the board. This is the definition. All right, guys. So let's read a text with it. And the kids don't know what it is. They don't know what it means. You've given an abstract definition for a word that they've never seen before, and you haven't broken it down through like, so if you give a dog a bone after it's barking at your door, you're appeasing it. And if you give a baby a bottle after it's crying, you're appeasing it, right? Appeasing means making someone happier or less angry by giving them something, right? And here's another example. And here's what this is. Is it appeasing when you bully someone? No, that's quite off, right? That's the opposite of what we're talking about. Teaching like this requires meticulous planning. And it's awesome when you get it right. When you get it right, you go, I just described this in a single lesson in a way that I never have in the past, because I really use principles of direct instruction and variation in how I present new information.
And that's where the depth comes, alluded to it earlier a little bit, isn't it? Where you actually take a concept, what it is. And we were talking the other week about the Key Stage 2 SATs and the fact that they see a shape and that's it. We don't look at the analogies in different ways and different orientations and just challenge their thinking. So therefore, when they have to think then independently about it, actually their explanation or their model of what they've got is only a singularity. They can't think about it in different contexts. And which made me then think about how does this direct instruction approach vary between subjects? Are there things that would work better in, like, say, some of the arts, like a music or art or design, that wouldn't work in the same way as English? Or does it all? Would you then argue that actually these principles can work along any discipline, and then it is the up to the subject expertise to say, actually, this is how we can do it?
I fall into the second thing you said. I think that explicit instruction is the way to teach anything new and get students to doing it independently in the most efficient way. How that looks, these are just aesthetic differences a lot of times, right? And not always, but a lot of times. It's funny when we talk about explicit instruction to a music teacher and they're going, what you mean? I stand at the front with my instrument or my baton and all that, and I wave it, and I orchestrate learning, and I get people to practice. That's all I do. And you go, yeah, right. And they'll even say they're like, well, I do group work. It's called everyone look at me and play along with me. This is explicit instruction. How you do it in sports, can often be understood as we're just good coaching, but good sports coaching is explicit instruction, right? The examples that you bring up, we talked about examples just now. The examples you bring up, I'm no expert in advanced science and math and so on. I'm an elementary teacher who got obsessed with teaching those things in your departments through developing your subject expertise. Those things are going to be different. And sort of the epistemology, like how what a historian needs to do or know, that sort of permeates through every bit of your lesson, that's going to be different. Or how scientists involve themselves in the scientific method. Some of those things, kind of epistemological knowledge, it's going to be different. But I don't buy the idea that our cognitive architecture changes from subject to subject. We have the same limitations of working memory that are overridden by what you know. And so how do you break it down? How do you get them to, how do you transfer the knowledge over to them in just small step presentations so that they can eventually express all of this as critical thinking, as creativity? That is a question for every teacher in every subject.
And I think some of the best examples are actually in sport. When you're thinking about doing a backflip, you're breaking that down, you're providing the scaffold, you're providing the cushions, literally the pads there, and saying, okay, these are the small steps. This is the prerequisite. Well, actually, you need to warm up. These are the stretches. They're going to make your body ready. And we're going to break this. We're going to praise you, going to check. We're going to keep going back towards it and breaking that journey down. Because it's the end of the session, 45-minute session, doesn't mean they're going to like, you haven't done it. Actually, next session, okay, this is where we got to. Let's revisit it. And then we can build on from there. And I think too often our restriction of lesson time means that actually we want to get it done. And I think that is also a problem, isn't it? In terms of, here's a traditional lesson, we've got an hour or 45 minutes, like this is the point I want to get to. But if our children aren't ready, they're not ready. And I think that's key, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, and a lot of times what happens with folks who say, I do a lot of explicit instruction or direct teaching, is they're really reacting to the fact that the kids aren't getting it. And they just say, like I did at the beginning of my career, right? Forget all this. This isn't working. Let's do it. Let me teach you. And you have to wonder how many kids wouldn't have fallen off the bus if you had been more preventative, if you'd taken a more just in case approach and given all that information up front. Also thinking about all that time that was wasted that could have actually been practice. They could have been practicing this. Instead, they were busy trying to figure it out, right? And then I know that other people might be able to mask this better than I did, but I often felt resentful to my students when they weren't getting it. I would express disappointment, maybe implicitly, that they didn't get it like I wanted them to. The opposite, though, happens when you teach up front, when you deliver a really well-crafted lesson, is that the kids feel successful. And now you're given praise left and right. My kids are on fire. This class is rowing the boat together. And you get a different type of education that just feels so much more satisfying for everyone, is my view on that.
So there's one thing, and it came up at the beginning. Adriana talked about the concept of this gradual faded guidance. How can we get children from novice learners, where we are, it's that dialogue, we're going back and forwards, but how can we get them to that independence? How can we get them to be expert in their own? How can we get them to that more practice? Because there is a danger, that preconceived idea, like it's just back and forwards, we're holding them very tight, but they don't have that opportunity, for example, to write at length or to do that. What are your thoughts behind that? Yeah,
you're going to want them to write at length, right? And luckily, like a lot of times people will see a really great teaching video of explicit instruction and they'll say, man, these kids are going to be exhausted by the end of the period, right? And I go, number one, good, like great, right? We're using the time efficiently. But also the videos that we show of just snippets of teachers doing turn and talk and choral response, they don't capture the independent practice. They're capturing kind of the guided practice, the we do. And yes, it is very demanding. And yes, the teacher's holding them back. Why though? It's not because they want to hold them back. It's not because all of us have the instinct to just skip steps, right? Let's be more efficient by jumping to the end. Maybe they'll be able to handle it, and they can't. And but there is always an independent practice element. And what's great about practicing at the end of a lesson is that becomes practice for things like your do now. That becomes practice for things like if you think of a lesson that could be multiple tracks where just a little bit of the information is new and a lot of it is interleaved or cumulative review of old material that you're bringing back in. Now your cumulative review is including old material, right? Kids are going to have a lot of time to practice. And I wouldn't say though that the practice is so extended that they can start to have their minds wander and they kind of get tired. You see kids putting their heads down. Those are signals that this is lasting too long, right? But you need to pass the baton, right? You hold the baton at first, and then you hold it together as the metaphor goes, and they've got to do it there. And that's where you're using formative. That's where you're assessing formatively that they get that. They understand it. Oh, it's not working. Bring everyone back to the board. Let's reteach something. We've got a misconception here in the room, folks. We've got to talk about this. It's all a system of assessment, a system of collecting information and adapting to the situation. I would work with the teacher in my coaching who didn't give them enough practice by simply saying, you gotta have more practice. The kids need to practice more independently, maybe with pairs, because they're not going to remember it otherwise. Right. So.
Brilliant. I've got one question I think that we could have started this whole conversation with, but I think our one of the last final questions is, you said in your book, if students aren't listening, nothing else matters. So what are the key conditions for this approach to work, and what do you need? And often it's not that often they go hand in hand as well. And we alluded to it earlier about the behavior side of it. So yeah, what are the conditions that we need to make sure that this is a priority and this works in our classrooms?
Yeah. We have to return to this idea that it is really incumbent upon us to regulate attention, to manage attention. And a lot of times, right, we get stuck in these wars and debates around, eye tracking and eye contact and a bunch of other things that are probably down to an individual basis. And there's certain things, certain students, whatever, there are exceptions. And it's just on Twitter, it gets silly in this area, but we can all agree, I hope, that kids need to be listening, and they need to be listening actively. And what does that mean, right? That means that they are selecting the information. They're directing their attention to the source of information. How you set up the environment really can influence this. A lot of times the students aren't paying attention. Let's not blame them. Let's make an adjustment to the environment where they sit. I've worked with teachers who said, I feel bad assigning children a seat or giving them a number on a seat. Like, I want them to sit with their friends, but they're always fighting with their friends. It's like, yeah, don't do that, right? Don't have them sit next to the one person who they want to socialize with for the entire period. And if you're in a kind of a loose or unstructured school, they've been hanging out with that friend all day and doing that at all the other lessons. Let's give them a chance in your class to learn something, right? Orienting their attention to the front. That for me, I like, two desks together or a table partner group so I can facilitate turn and talks. But I'm not against rows. In that rows, you can do the same thing, just a little bit of leaning. You teach them how to lean a little bit and put them into single rows or in a horseshoe frame where they're all looking at you in a U shape. These things communicate to the student, it's this is where I need to focus my attention. And finally, we are sort of past this, but I received a lot of abuse, I guess, online for phones. Finally, mobile phones in the United States are a hot topic. Everyone's pretending like they believed in bans all along. And I swear on my life, before COVID, was talking about cell phone bans. So not letting those devices into the environment, having them in their bag or in some phone jail or whatever else. These are all things you can do to make it so your school is productive, calm, conducive to learning, and a teacher who teaches the whole time and constantly is engaging everyone through responses.
And it's making sure you're setting up for success and actually removing all that extraneous load that you don't need. And we talked often about what's on the tables, what can children get to, who is around them, and do those seating plans consider. And Adrian, but just are you having praise reward systems in place to promote listening and for engagement? Do you consider seating plans? What's your thought on those, like reward systems and seating plans as well?
Yeah. That's the first thing I do when I come into a school that's struggling with behavior is try to put those two things in place. Let's have seating plans. Let's have a do now so that we have at least the start of the lesson has a structure. Maybe later down the road, we'll talk about an exit routine. My favorite exit routine is that the teacher has assessed everything through an exit ticket already, right? And now last minute, the last 1 minute, students put their kit back together, put it in their backpack, push in their chair and are standing. And then the teacher's asking retrieval questions quickly around the room, one row at a time. You're dismissed into the hallway. That way they don't pop like a cork into the hallway and and create a bunch of noise there. Every class is silently exited. So then they immediately have a do now to start the lesson when they get to the next classroom. But these reward systems, like merit systems, there's just so many ways to do them. I love just the low tech way of there's certain sheets that someone collects that are on every teacher's podium that the teacher just very quickly merit for you, merit for you, merit for you. There's other digital ways. In the US, a lot of people use a certain platform that does this, that the teacher just needs to project or maybe have it covert on their laptop, but they're constantly inputting these little dings, these little nudges. What you're praising for is not things that should already be expected. Oftentimes, you're not praising for writing your name in good handwriting, or you're not praising for doing things that you're already doing. You're praising new behaviors you're introducing. Things like when I do a choral response, we all respond in unison, 3, 2, 1. I give some praise and I slowly take away the praise and I switch to another specific behavior that I'm looking for. And I'm going to praise that thing for a little while. Also, just as you narrate what you expect, you're giving merits to students so that you create these pro-social norms, this culture in your class that in order to achieve and succeed, I need to do certain things. Like I need to sit up. I need to be writing with everyone else. I need to be raising my hand. So you're always naming behaviors, praising behaviors, and giving students a little bit of an incentive. Not everybody is intrinsically motivated to do everything, right? And I certainly don't want to do a lot of things for, without at least a high five, at least some sort of, in the real world, I want money usually, right? So the idea of like kids should just be motivated and it's their fault if they're not. I don't buy into that. I think I see an integrated behavior merit system in explicit instruction.
Yeah, and it's that reward of having an answer or being able to share something. And even if the child doesn't have it initially, it's breaking that down for them and them having the opportunity to succeed in that inherent motivation as well as the reward systems. I've seen it and it is so impactful and so transformational. But probably your hardest question to finish on is, what's that one thing you want teachers to go away with thinking about explicit instruction, what it is, or maybe a misconception that they may have seen before, that you would like to leave our audience with, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I just want people to not feel bad about going down the path of learning about this methodology, right? I want people to understand that it has a history going all the way back to the largest educational experiment in the United States called Project Follow Through. It has process product research that backs it. That's basically teacher effectiveness research that's best summarized by Rosenshine's principles. And that now we have all these randomized controlled trials around cognitive load theory, attention, and practice, and so on, that really show some causality that these ingredients are effective for learners. So if you're in a space where, gosh, inquiry is the name of the game, and everybody's going down that path, but in hushed whispers in the staff room, we all realize this isn't working, right? It's time to switch tactics. They're not working, right? And so this book, I think, is supposed to be a quick primer with checks and specific moves that you can do. But as you enter into there, you go to things like Teaching Secondary Science by Adam Boxer for science, right? Or you go look at Todd Needham's book about English teaching, and you look at your own subject, and you develop sort of deeper understandings of all of these kind of buckets that I brought to you. And as you do that, you start feeling more fulfilled, and you start feeling like, I got in this to teach, and I got in this to see kids learning, and now I'm seeing success. I feel accomplished as I am just tweaking my practice one thing at a time. And eventually, I think we're going to start a movement here in the United States where there are at least some schools that have an interest in just teaching them, or just telling them what they need to know and then getting them to practice it.
And I think that's a brilliant segue. And I think, Zach, thank you so much for not just coming on tonight, but to writing this book. This is a great book to talk about. It's something that you'll go back into it. And it's not one that's just a primer of going through and saying, okay, yeah, here's what I've done with my examples. Let's go back and see about what it is, what it also, and the examples and imagery and everything you've got in the book is fantastic. So if you want to get your own copy of Just Tell Them by Zach Groshell, please go to John Catt. And thank you very much, John Catt, for sponsoring this show. We're in partnership with Teachers Talk Radio. Their publishers are professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. And lots of the books we mentioned tonight are also available on their website at johncattbookshop.com. You can use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Also, on the 1st of March, we have got our very first multi-subject national event called Teachers Talk Connect. We'll be up in Manchester at the Friends Meeting House, and we've got subjects all over from English, maths, science, primary, history, and MFL, and many more. We've got some amazing keynotes, and if you're a teacher currently working in ages 3 to 19 in schools or colleges, your tickets are free. So if you want to find out more about that, please go to ttradio.org. And I want to say thank you once again, Zach. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I know hopefully it won't be 2 years again since we come back on and have you as a friend on one of the shows. So thank you, Zach, and take care. And I look forward to all the work you're doing with this in the background. It's brilliant to follow you. And if anyone wants to follow Zach on X, it's at Mr. Zach G. Thank you and good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.